Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and get straight to the most compelling evidence.
It's great to be here.
Today, we are tackling a question that really it impacts everyone as they age. Can you actually, by changing your diet, slow down cognitive decline? And can you reduce your risk of developing dementia?
And we're not just talking about, eat your veggies. This is about a highly specific nutritional strategy called the MIND diet.
Right. And that name, the MIND diet, it stands for something pretty specific.
It does. It's the Mediterranean-Age intervention for neurodegenerative delay. And it's been one of the most, I'd say, exciting areas in nutritional science for the past decade. It's this hybrid pattern that has just generated so much optimism.
And that optimism is driven by some really persuasive and consistent long-term data about protecting the brain.
Exactly.
So we've done a really exhaustive deep dive into the source material here. We're not just looking at headlines or press releases. We've been digging into a comprehensive stack of the highest quality evidence. We're talking large prospective cohort studies, primarily from really trusted sources like the Rush Memory and Aging Project, the MAP study, along with meta-analyses, and of course, the gold standard.
The randomized controlled trials.
The RCTs, including that huge landmark study that was just published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine.
And I think our mission today needs to be laser focused. We have to extract the definitive, the evidence-backed components of the MIND diet.
Oh, okay.
We want to clarify the strongest claims, especially those staggering numbers you see about reducing Alzheimer's risk. But really, I think most importantly, we owe it to you, the listener, to give a realistic picture of what this diet can and can't do.
And to do that, we have to rigorously look at the relationship between those decades-long observational findings and the much shorter-term intervention-based trials.
And that is where it gets fascinating.
It is. That assessment leads us right to our key insight tease for today. It's this paradox that sits right at the center of the whole MIND diet story. The initial observational studies, the ones that followed thousands of people for years and years, they showed this absolutely massive potential benefit. We are talking about up to a 53% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease for the people who stuck to it the best.
53%. Just pause on that number for a second. It's an astonishing risk reduction.
Yeah.
It suggests the diet is nearly as potent as some of the drugs being studied. So you can imagine the initial optimism.
Of course.
But, and this is the essential nuance we have to unpack, the largest, most rigorous, high-quality 3-year randomized controlled trial.
The one we just mentioned.
That very one.
Yeah.
It took older adults who were already at high risk for dementia, and it showed no significant difference in cognitive change compared to the control group. And that control group was just following general healthy eating advice with some mild calorie restriction.
So that's the crux of the issue right there. If the specific mind pattern didn't give an extra boost in that short-term trial, why did we see such profound, just incredible benefits in the long-term studies?
It points to a deeper complexity. Is the benefit really about the specific mix of foods, the berries and the greens, or is it about the cumulative effect of a sustained healthy pattern over decades?
Right. That's the question we need to unpack. So let's dive in and define exactly what this pattern is.
Let's do it.
So let's start with the basics. The MIND diet isn't just another trend you see on social media. It's a deliberate, scientifically designed construct. What's the philosophy behind how it was created?
The philosophy is all about targeted neuroprotection. That's the key phrase. Researchers didn't just, pick healthy foods out of a hat. They looked at the totality of evidence, epidemiological studies, basic science linking specific nutrients and food groups to better brain aging.
So they're looking for things that specifically help the brain, not just the body in general.
Precisely. And the core concept is that MIND is a powerful, very smart hybrid of two other highly respected dietary patterns that already existed.
The Mediterranean diet and the DAH diet, I think most people have probably heard of those.
Exactly. The Mediterranean diet is famous for being heart protective, anti-inflammatory, and full of antioxidants. And then you have the DAH diet, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, which is incredibly effective at controlling blood pressure and improving vascular health.
And we know that vascular health is critical for brain health. Things like high blood pressure are huge risk factors for cognitive decline.
A major risk factor. So combining those two just made perfect sense. But, and this is the crucial part, the researchers then tailored it even further. They didn't just average the two diets.
Okay, so what did they do?
They selectively emphasized foods that were very strongly linked to neuroprotection, like berries. And they aggressively restricted foods that have been linked to things like oxidative stress, inflammation, and accelerated cognitive aging.
That selectivity seems to be what really defines the MIND diet.
It is. And to make it research grade, they created a quantifiable scoring system. This is so important for validity. It ranges from 0 to 15 points.
And this lets researchers actually measure how well someone is following the diet.
Precisely. The original MAP studies showed that the higher your score, the better your adherence, the greater the long-term benefit that they observed.
Okay, so let's break down those 15 components. I understand you get points for eating from 10 brain-healthy food groups. So which 10 made the cut and why those specific ones?
Right, so the 10 encouraged groups are green leafy vegetables, first and foremost, then other vegetables, berries, nuts, beans, whole grains, fish, poultry.
Okay.
The use of olive oil as your primary fat, and then wine, which is listed as an optional component. The target there is no more than 1 glass per day.
So for each of those categories, if you hit a minimum target, you get 1 point, up to 10 points.
You get 1 point, exactly. And then you have the other side of the coin. You can lose points, or technically you're reverse scored for the 5 food groups that the diet specifically limits.
Because they're linked to, well, poorer outcomes for your brain and your blood vessels.
Correct. So you want to stay under the limit for red meat, for butter and margarine, for cheese, pastries and sweets, and fried and fast foods.
The goal here seems to be strict limitation, not necessarily complete elimination.
That's a good way to put it. Intake has to be very minimal to score that point back. The real target is controlling saturated fats and refined sugars, which are just known promoters of inflammation in the body and the brain.
Now, just saying eat more leafy greens isn't specific enough for a study. You have to hit these quantitative thresholds to get your point.
Yeah.
So what are the key minimums that researchers use to define what high adherence actually looks like?
This is where you really see the unique weighting of the MIND diet. It's what distinguishes it. The most heavily weighted component, based on all the observational data, is leafy greens.
Leafy greens, so spinach, kale, things like that.
Exactly. Spinach, kale, collard greens. And for those, you need at least 6 servings per week.
6 servings a week, that's almost daily. That tells you how strongly the researchers must believe in the benefits of those specific foods.
It's a huge commitment, and it speaks volumes. The thinking is that it's likely a synergy of several factors in those greens.
Like what? What's so special about kale?
Well, they're packed with vitamin K, which is linked to neuronal health. They have folate, which helps regulate homocysteine. That's a known risk factor for cognitive problems. And they are incredibly rich in carotenoids like lutein and zeaxanthin.
Okay.
These actually accumulate in the retina and the brain, and they act as really powerful antioxidants, protecting your neural tissue from damage.
Yeah.
The emphasis is on consistency. You want that antioxidant load every single day.
So that's greens. The second major priority is berries. And this is interesting to me because usually you just hear, eat more fruit. Why did the MIND diet single out berries specifically? You need at least 2 servings per week for that point.
Yeah, this is a key differentiator. Berries, mostly blueberries and strawberries in the studies, are the only fruit that's specifically emphasized. And it's entirely because of their unparalleled concentration of a type of polyphenol called flavonoids.
Flavonoids.
Specifically a subgroup called anthocyanins. These compounds are highly effective at crossing the blood-brain barrier. They get into your brain, reduce inflammation, and improve signaling pathways in the hippocampus.
Which is the brain's memory center.
The memory center. So you're essentially bathing the brain in these anti-inflammatory agents.
So if you nail the greens and the berries, you've really built the unique foundation of the diet. What about the other foundational foods that kind of sustain the whole pattern?
Right. So for nuts, which provide healthy fats and fiber, the goal is at least 5 servings per week.
So a handful a day on weekdays, basically.
That's a great way to think about it. For whole grains, which are crucial for fiber and stable energy, you're targeting at least 3 servings per day.
3 a day, so that's a real staple.
It is. And beans or legumes should be eaten at least 3 times a week. You also want at least 1 serving of fish, non-fried fatty fish like salmon is best, and at least 2 servings of poultry per week. And the overarching daily habit is just replacing things like butter with olive oil.
Let's go back to those limitations for a second, the 5 restricted groups, because these targets seem incredibly strict if you're used to a typical Western diet. What are the absolute ceilings you have to stay under?
They are very restrictive, and that's by design. They're targeting the main sources of saturated fat and refined sugar. So, to earn your point, you want to keep butter or margarine under 1 tablespoon per day.
Wow, okay. 1 tablespoon.
Cheese is limited to 1 serving or less per week. It's not a daily thing.
Ah,
Fried or fast food has to be restricted to one time or less per week,
once a week
a
max.
max. And red meat, that includes beef, lamb, processed meats, is limited to less than 4 servings per week. Hitting these limits is absolutely non-negotiable if you want to achieve a high 9 score in these studies.
So in those big observational studies like the Rush MAPE study, what score did you need to get to be in that high adherence group that saw those huge benefits?
Consistently, high adherence was defined as being in the top third of scores,
Mm.
and that typically meant scoring a 9 or a 9.5 out of 15 or even higher.
So you really had to hit most of the positive targets and stay under most of the negative limits.
You did. And it's worth noting that moderate adherence, which was generally scores between 7.5 and 9, still showed really significant benefits.
Okay, let's shift to the overall nutritional profile. The MIND diet, it intentionally avoids things like calorie counting or specific meal timing. But if you're following it closely, what does your macronutrient intake naturally look like?
It's fundamentally a plant-forward diet that's high in quality fats.
Mm-hmm.
It naturally leads to a really robust fiber intake, usually somewhere between 25 to 35 grams a day, which is, well, it's far more than the average American gets.
And the fat.
Fat consumption is moderate, maybe 30 to 40% of your total calories.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is the critical part, the quality of that fat is what matters. It's overwhelmingly monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats from the olive oil, the nuts, the fish.
And that structure keeps the bad stuff, the saturated fat, very low.
Very low, typically less than 7% of total calories, which is why it has this dual benefit for both your blood vessels and your brain health.
That low saturated fat intake, that's a key feature, linking it right back to the DSAS diet's success.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important to bring up that caveat we mentioned earlier. While the diet itself doesn't demand calorie restriction, a lot of the big trials, including the NEJM study, paired it with counseling for mild calorie restriction.
Right.
So some of the positive metabolic changes you see in those studies are probably, at least in part, driven by the modest weight loss that people achieved.
That makes sense. Okay, let's move on to the data that really put the MIND diet on the map. The cognitive health findings. The early observational research from the Rush Memory and Aging Project was just entering. It was incredibly consistent and positive. Why are those particular studies considered so reliable?
The Rush MAP study is one of the most trusted and longest-running cohort studies out there, focused specifically on aging and neurodegeneration. Its reliability comes from its size, over 1,000 people, and its prospective design.
Meaning they measured diet first, then followed people over time.
Exactly. They measured dietary intake at the beginning and then just followed the participants forward for years and years, collecting this incredibly comprehensive data, clinical, cognitive, and crucially neuropathological data after death.
So what were the headline numbers on slowing cognitive decline that first got everyone so excited?
Well, the analysis from the Rush MAP study, which followed older adults for up to 10 years, found a really profound link. Participants with the highest adherence to the MIND diet experienced a significantly slower rate of global cognitive decline.
Slower than those with the lowest adherence.
Much slower. And when the researchers quantified that difference, they found it was equivalent to being 7.5 years younger cognitively.
I want to pause on that. 7.5 years. Can you put that into perspective for us? Because that's not just a statistical blip.
No, it's a massive clinical finding. To give you some context, that size of an effect is comparable to the protective effect you see from things we already know are pillars of brain health, like highly consistent physical exercise or having a higher level of formal education. The diet was essentially acting as this powerful longevity factor for the brain. It was functionally reversing years of expected cognitive aging.
And the data on reducing the actual incidence of Alzheimer's disease was maybe even more dramatic.
It was startlingly effective. In that same group of people, those who achieved high adherence scores of 9.5 or higher were associated with a dramatic 53% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's over the follow-up period.
And that was after adjusting for other risk factors.
Yes. That finding was rigorously adjusted for other major risk factors like education, physical activity, even total calorie intake.
53% is a number you usually hear associated with, I don't know, strong genetic factors or a powerful drug. It's hard to ignore a number that big.
It is. And it wasn't an all-or-nothing effect either. The researchers found that even people with just moderate adherence scoring between 7.5 and 9 still saw a significant 35% reduction in their risk.
Which suggests a dose-response relationship.
Exactly. Every little step you take toward better adherence seems to provide some measurable protection. And that's a crucial message, because it means you don't have to be perfect to start seeing a benefit.
And this wasn't just a one-off finding in one group of people, was it? It was confirmed elsewhere.
Absolutely. Consistency is the hallmark of reliable observational science. A big meta-analysis published in a major journal pooled data from 11 different cohorts, all different populations.
And what did it find?
It confirmed the robust association. They found that for every 3-point increase in your mind score, there was about a 17% lower risk of developing dementia. This broad confirmation gives that observational evidence a lot of confidence.
Okay, so that builds a really compelling case for the long-term benefits. But now we have to introduce the critical counter-evidence, the randomized trial hurdle. This is where we have to temper all that excitement with the need to prove direct causation, not just an association.
This is the essential check and balance in science. An association, no matter how strong, doesn't prove that one thing caused the other. For that gold standard proof, you really need a randomized controlled trial.
And the trial in question is that big, multi-site, 3-year NEJM study from 2023.
That's the one. It was designed specifically to test the causal hypothesis of the mind diet on cognitive function.
So tell us about the design of that trial. Who are the participants?
It was a very rigorous, well-funded trial with over 600 older adults, aged 65 to 84. And crucially, these people were specifically selected because they were already at high risk for dementia.
How so?
They were overweight or obese, and they had a family history of dementia. And the trial also used what's called an active control group. This wasn't a placebo group that did nothing.
Let's clarify that, because the control group is the key comparison point. What did they have to do?
Both groups, the mind group and the active control group, got counseling for mild caloric restriction. The goal was modest weight loss for everyone, but the active control group was simply counseled to follow a general, healthy, calorie-reduced diet. It wasn't specifically mind-based.
So the comparison was mind plus weight loss versus just general healthy eating plus weight loss. What did the 3-year results show for cognitive change?
The main outcome was the change in global cognition, measured with a whole battery of standardized tests. And the result was definitive. There was no significant difference in the change in global cognition between the mind group and the control group over those 3 years.
No difference. What about in the brain scans? Did the MRIs show anything?
Nothing significant there either. They did state-of-the-art MRI analysis, looking at brain volume, hippocampal volume, white matter damage, all markers of neurodegeneration. And both groups showed pretty similar changes. The mind diet didn't prove to be superior in preserving brain structure over that 3-year period.
So if both groups improved a little bit from where they started, which they did, and neither was statistically better than the other, what interpretation do we have to draw from this major RCT?
The interpretation is absolutely critical for managing expectations. It strongly suggests that for this specific high-risk group, over a relatively short period of 3 years, the specific blend of the mind diet, the extra berries, the extra greens, was not superior to just general healthy eating, as long as that healthy eating was also coupled with modest weight loss.
So this outcome prevents us from saying that the mind diet itself causes short-term cognitive improvement.
Exactly. It lowers our confidence in short-term causality. It suggests that maybe the more immediate drivers of benefit are things like weight management and just avoiding highly inflammatory foods, rather than the specific neuroprotective synergy of the mind components.
Which makes the distinction between association and causation crystal clear. But let's go back to those long-term studies. If the benefit is cumulative over decades, we should look at the biological mechanisms they found that might explain those incredible results.
Absolutely. The long-term data lets us look inside the brain, literally. Post-mortem analysis of brains from the MAP cohort showed some striking pathological results in the people who followed the diet best.
What did they find?
High mind adherence was associated with a lower brain amyloid load and significantly lowered neurofibrillary tangle density in the hippocampus.
That is massive. Amyloid plaques and tau tangles are the two defining pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. How can a diet do that?
This is where the specific ingredients probably matter a lot. The high intake of specific phytochemicals, those anthocyanins in berries, the vitamin E and omega-3s in nuts and fish, are thought to interrupt the inflammatory cascade that drives all this plaque and tangle formation.
So the diet is providing the building blocks for the brain's immune system to clear out the junk before it builds up.
That's a great way to think about it. It helps the brain's immune cells, the microglia, to efficiently clear waste products. And we see more evidence of this on imaging studies. Higher lifetime MINDY scores are consistently associated with larger total brain volume and more gray matter.
which suggests enhanced cognitive reserve.
Exactly. The brain can function optimally for longer, even if some subtle pathology starts to creep in.
And since the mind diet is half DAH diet, the vascular and inflammatory mechanisms have to be just as important.
They're completely intertwined. Alzheimer's is increasingly being seen as, in part, a vascular disease. Studies found that higher mind adherence was linked to better cardiometabolic markers, lipids, glucose, and a significant reduction in systemic inflammation.
And what does that better blood flow and lower inflammation look like inside the brain itself?
Well, on MRIs, you see less white matter hyperintensity volume. Those are basically little markers of damage or reduced blood flow. It confirms the diet is protecting the small, fragile blood vessels in the brain, making sure your neurons get the oxygen and nutrients they need, which is fundamental to long-term health.
So while the cognitive evidence has this fascinating tension between the long-term association and the short-term trial, the physical health benefits seem much more consistent. What does the evidence say there?
You're right, the physical health evidence is much more consistent and uh, less controversial. This is largely because the benefits of the DHE components have been established for decades. Systematic reviews really confirm the mind diet's effectiveness here.
Let's start with the basics, things like weight and body composition.
Sure, observational data and smaller trials consistently report favorable changes. When you put people on the mind diet in a study, especially if you pair it with calorie restriction, you see modest but very consistent reductions in BMI, total body weight, and waist circumference.
And that's important because obesity itself is a known risk factor for dementia.
A huge risk factor. And then you look at core metabolic risks, lipids, and glucose. The diet's profile, with high fiber, high unsaturated fats, and low saturated fats, is perfectly designed to improve these markers.
So what kind of changes do we see?
Systematic reviews show significant improvements, reductions in total cholesterol and LDL or bad cholesterol, triglycerides. And for glucose control, we see lower fasting glucose and often better insulin sensitivity.
Which is vital since type 2 diabetes is such a massive risk factor for Alzheimer's.
A massive one. And in fact, the impact on type 2 diabetes risk itself is very strong in the observational data. Cohort studies link a high adherence to a substantial reduction in your risk of ever developing the disease, up to a 37% lower risk in some studies.
Wow. So it acts as a powerful preventative tool.
It seems to. And of course, we can't forget the DSH legacy, blood pressure control. That benefit is consistently reaffirmed. Observational studies show about a 17% lower risk of developing hypertension over 10 years.
And in clinical trials.
You see modest but statistically significant reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. It might only be a 3 to 5 point drop in systolic, which sounds small, but on a population level, that kind of control has huge implications for preventing strokes and heart attacks.
So if we look at that whole physical health picture, what's our overall confidence level?
The confidence level, the grade rating, for these physical and cardiometabolic benefits is considered low to moderate. It's supported by a lot of systematic reviews and smaller RCTs. The evidence is pretty solid.
Now for the biggest question of all, longevity. Does following the mind diet actually translate into living longer?
This is a complex area because you have to follow people for decades, which makes RCTs almost impossible. So the evidence we have is observational, but the signal is consistently positive and it's strong.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Several large cohort analyses found that higher mind scores were significantly associated with lower all-cause mortality over very long follow-ups, like 12 to 15 years.
Can you quantify that benefit?
Yes. In several cohorts, they reported about a 10 to 12% lower risk of dying from any cause for every single point increase in your 15-point mind score.
So every point really counts.
It seems to.
Yeah.
And when you compare the highest followers to the lowest, some studies show up to a 37% lower risk of all-cause mortality. It's comparable in scale to the Alzheimer's risk reduction we talked about earlier.
That's incredible.
What's also really compelling is that this protection seems to be strongest in people who are already at high risk, people with existing diabetes or hypertension. For them, the diet seems to act as a critical management tool.
But we do have to note the limitation here. It's observational, so there's the healthy user bias.
That's a valid and important consideration. People who stick to the mind diet are often doing other healthy things too. Researchers try to adjust for that, but you can never completely rule it out. So the evidence for longevity is officially rated low, even though it's biologically very plausible.
Okay, finally, let's touch on mental well-being beyond just memory, things like mood, anxiety, quality of life. Does the mind diet make people feel better?
The data here is the most preliminary, but it is promising. Higher mind adherence has been associated with lower depression scores, and a reduced risk of developing depression.
Huh.
For example, one large study found that high adherers had up to 26% lower odds of recurrent depressive symptoms over a 13-year period. The thinking is it's related to reducing systemic inflammation, which we know can impact mood and brain function.
That's a huge potential benefit, especially with the known link between depression and cognitive decline.
Absolutely. We also see links in snapshot and time studies to improve quality of life metrics and even suggestions of better sleep quality. But again, our confidence level here is currently very low. It's an area with high potential, but we need dedicated RCTs to prove it.
Okay, this is the moment we bring all this data back into the kitchen. We have this clear scoring system, 0 to 15, and these specific thresholds. How do you, the listener, actually translate that into sustainable daily habits?
The best way to start is by focusing on the highest leverage components first. Aim for consistency, not perfection. If you can just move from low adherence to moderate, so a score of 7 or higher, you're already capturing a huge chunk of the benefit we see in the studies.
So let's identify what we could call the big three swaps that give the most cognitive bang for your buck.
Right. They're the specific things that make mine different from DSE. First, you have to prioritize the green leafy vegetables. Aim for 6 or more servings per week. A serving is about a cup raw or half a cup cooked.
So that means a handful in a smoothie, a side of spinach with dinner, a big salad for lunch.
Exactly. Get it in daily. The second cornerstone is berries. Aim for 2 or more servings per week. And remember, frozen berries are just as good nutritionally and often way more affordable and accessible.
Okay, so greens and berries are the non-negotiables. What are the other foundational habits that get you up toward that high score of 9?
Make olive oil your only added fat for cooking and dressings. That's an easy point right there. And then focus on whole grains. Aim for at least 3 servings per day. This means being strategic. Look for bread where whole wheat is the first ingredient. Swap white rice for brown rice or quinoa. Start your day with real oatmeal.
And what about nuts? 5 servings a week. That's basically a handful every day.
It is. A quarter cup serving daily 5 times a week as a snack or tossed on a salad. Consistency is key.
Now, for the hard part for a lot of people, the limiting factors. Where should we focus our energy when we're trying to restrict those unhealthy foods?
Focus on the big sources of saturated fat. The critical restrictions are dramatically cutting back on butter and margarine, less than 1 tablespoon a day, and severely restricting cheese to 1 serving or less per week.
Oof. Once a week for cheese is tough, but it's a key part of the score.
It is. It's one of the things that distinguishes mine from a more permissive Mediterranean diet. And finally, the lifestyle culprits. Fried and fast foods. You have to be strict here. Limit them to 1 time or less per week.
Okay, so if a listener starts today, they need realistic expectations about the timeline. We know from the RCT that the cognitive payoff isn't a quick fix.
That is vital expectation management. In the short term, we're talking weeks to months, you should expect to see improvements in your metabolic markers. Your lipids will look better, your fasting glucose might come down, you might lose a little weight. That's the immediate win.
And the cognitive payoff.
The cognitive protection, that dramatic reduction in dementia risk, is strongly linked to long-term adherence. We're talking 4 or more years of consistent effort based on the studies. This is a preventative strategy that works over decades. The sustained adherence is what matters.
Let's talk about safety. Is there any risk to adopting this diet?
The safety profile is exceptionally good. Trials report no serious adverse events or nutritional deficiencies. It's a very nutrient-dense, well-tolerated way of eating.
But there is one very important medication interaction we have to warn people about.
Yes, and this is critical. It's for patients on the blood thinner warfarin. Warfarin works by blocking vitamin K. The MIND diet is packed with green leafy vegetables, which are a massive source of vitamin K.
So a sudden increase in greens could throw off their medication levels?
It could destabilize their INR levels, which is dangerous. The guidance is not to avoid greens, but to be absolutely consistent and to talk to your doctor. If you adopt this diet, your intake of vitamin K foods needs to be stable day to day, and your INR needs to be monitored closely by your clinician.
Are there any other groups that need to be cautious?
Just briefly, people with chronic kidney disease, especially advanced CKD, may need to modify it. The diet is high in potassium and phosphorus from beans and nuts, which often need to be restricted, so they'd need guidance from a renal dietitian.
Finally, let's address the practical barriers. Cost and accessibility. Is this an expensive way to eat?
Not necessarily, though it's a legitimate concern. Cost analyses suggest it's generally comparable to a typical Western diet, if you shop strategically.
So how do you shop smart for brain health?
You substitute. Use frozen berries instead of fresh. Use canned or dried beans and lentils. They're incredibly cost-effective. And substitute expensive red meat with more economical fish like canned salmon or tuna and poultry. That helps manage the budget while still hitting all your targets.
So it's very doable with some planning.
It is. And we know from the trials that adherence is so much better when people get structured support meal plans, shopping lists, that kind of thing. So starting small with those actionable swaps is the key to making it sustainable.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. From that stunning 53% risk reduction we see in long-term studies like Rush MAP to the necessary cautionary note from that null cognitive result in the big 3-year RCT. So how do we put this all together? What's the final evidence-backed conclusion for our listeners?
I think the primary conclusion remains highly favorable, as long as we're realistic about the timeline. The MIND diet is a safe, evidence-based, neuroprotective eating pattern. We have moderate evidence from those large, consistent, decades-long observational studies supporting a robust reduction in long-term Alzheimer's risk.
And for physical health.
We also have moderate evidence supporting its effectiveness in improving cardiometabolic health, your weight, your lipids, your blood pressure.
Yeah.
That's backed by the strong DSH Foundation and lots of smaller trials.
So the diet is absolutely worth adopting, but we just can't promise a quick cognitive fix.
Precisely. We have to be clear. Despite the very strong signal that this diet slows cognitive decline by functionally making you 7.5 years younger, the gold standard 3-year trial did not find that the specific MIND blend offered a measurable cognitive advantage over general healthy eating plus weight loss in the short term.
It tells us that the diet needs time. It needs years to work its magic on the brain's pathology.
Exactly.
So if you, the listener, walk away with 3 actionable takeaways, what should they be?
First, think of the MIND diet as a well-supported, low-risk prevention strategy. It's a lifestyle pillar, not a cure.
Okay.
Second, focus ruthlessly on the non-negotiables. The cognitive cornerstones are leafy greens, 6 or more servings a week, and berries, 2 or more servings a week. That's what makes the MIND diet special.
And third,
You don't need perfection to get protection. Aim for a score of 7 or higher. That's moderate adherence to start seeing potential benefits. Don't let the pursuit of a perfect score derail you from making good, sustainable progress.
that's extremely clear and actionable. And finally, the critical question we want to leave you with to explore on your own, a question that comes directly from that tension in the evidence we've discussed today. Given that the specific MIND diet didn't outperform general healthy eating coupled with weight loss in the 3-year trial, the question remains, are the massive long-term cognitive benefits we see due purely to the specific neuroprotective foods, the berries and the greens? Or is the sustained, decades-long reduction of vascular and cardiometabolic risk the real primary driver of protection against neurodegeneration?
And to build on that, if the answer is that it requires decades of sustained risk reduction, what other complementary lifestyle factors, that things beyond diet, like physical activity, cognitive engagement, social interaction, are working in synergy with the MIND diet to create the profound cognitive resilience we see in those longest-running cohorts?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the MIND diet. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and ready to put this knowledge to use as a long-term pillar of your health. We'll see you next time.